All right, good morning, class, and welcome back to World Studies. I hope everybody had a restful and awesome spring break. I am still out for the next 2 weeks as I am taking care of my little baby at home. But in the meantime, I thought I would share with you guys some more knowledge about Latin America. And this is going to be our kind of like final lecture about Latin American history and stuff like that. And then tomorrow, I will probably be explaining what our essay slash project is going to be for Latin America, which is going to look at some current issues in the region. We're going to focus today, though, on two countries in particular, and then South America more generally. And this time period of 1804 to 1830, when revolution was running rampant across Latin America. Let's get started. Oh, yeah. This shows us the years that different Latin American countries were able to maintain, or excuse me, attain their independence. And you notice that in blue, this means they're getting it from España. And you see the British, Dutch, French, Portuguese on there as well, these different colonial powers. We're going to focus on Mexico as well as on the island of Haiti today as the two main countries, but also look at this string of victories across the West Coast and the northern part of South America. Now, why are people rebelling? Because they want to be free. And this is a time of greater political thought, and it was what we call the Enlightenment, the age of reason, where people are supposed to be making more rational political choices, and definitely a rejection of the divine right of kings, which is if someone's born a king, that means they have the right to rule. And as someone not a monarchist, of course, I find that ridiculous. But opposition to monarchy began to rise more and more around the world. And the lower class people began to feel like they should have more of a say in control of their government. So, this age of reason, we often talk about the focus on science, having a more fair economy, and then also the rise of individualism. Is the happiness of the individual more important than the happiness of society? So the Enlightenment, of course, spawns lots of different revolutions. You guys are probably very familiar with the United States Revolution, okay, in which a bunch of very wealthy people decided they didn't want to pay taxes to the British. And there were some other things. So they decided to rebel against them. And just like in North America, in Latin America, the people leading these revolutions are often the elite. Okay. And they're doing it so they can have more political power over their country. If you guys were unaware, George Washington was the richest man in America when he led the army that led to independence for our country. So a lot of these revolutions are going to have the same high-minded ideals, freedom, equality for all, but just like in the US, they'll often fall kind of short in delivering that for the greater mass of people. Okay. We had the US Revolution, and the US Revolution was very much helped along by the French government, who paid our militia guys millions and millions of dollars to fight the British. And in the process, the French government kind of bankrupted themselves, which led to a revolution in their own country. And probably the most influential revolution in world history is this French Revolution, because it was a rising up of not only the elites, but also a broader class of people to demand equal rights. And if we look at the Caribbean, because that's where we're going to start today, initially, Spain is the first country in, but then, of course, it's followed by many others. And we're going to take a look at this island here of Hispaniola, which is made up of the Dominican Republic on the right over here, and then Haiti on the left side. The Dominican Republic will be ruled by España. Eventually, Haiti will be ruled by the French Republic. Okay. Now, I wish we had a lot more time in this class to talk about Europe because there's so much great history from there. And you guys have probably heard this man's name before, but he's going to play a very crucial role in Latin American independence. And this man is Napoleon Bonaparte, who is the Corsican, who becomes the Emperor of France, and in modern history is the greatest general of all time. But he's going to be kicking butt all over Europe, and he's going to kick the butt of a bunch of countries that were occupying Latin America as well. And Napoleon, representing Corsica, it's his little island down here, but he is a French citizen. He eventually conquers most of his neighbors, including España. And let's look a little bit at Haiti today. Today, Haiti is unfortunately the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, in our half of the world, with the average person there only making about $800 per year. Okay. And about 60% of the population is in poverty, and their life expectancy is relatively low. And they do have a relatively high infant mortality rate. And geography, of course, plays a factor. But in this case, the history of this island and how it got its independence is going to kind of determine the circumstances it finds itself in today. So Haiti was found a long time ago by Columbus, right at the very beginning. And España ruled the island for about 100 years, 200 years. And then France, through some wars, was able to take Haiti over. And like most of the islands of the Caribbean, they're going to end up being enslaved colonies. Okay. First, the Spanish enslaved the native people. Most of those native people, if not all of them, will die of disease and the horrors of slavery. To replace that missing native labor, the Spanish and then others will import enslaved West African people to bring them to work the land and to grow crops. And in Haiti, the major crop is going to be sugar. And today, sugar is super cheap. Okay. For like $5, you can buy a 5-pound bag of sugar. Back then, it was not. It was one of the most expensive products in the world. And so a place like Haiti that could grow tons of sugar was such a benefit to the home colonies of France. So Haiti made France tons of money off of the enslaved people that are growing the sugar, as well as some coffee there. And the overseers, of course, would be terrible to the people, but in Haiti, these people would rise up. Okay, enslaved West Africans, but then they didn't want to be enslaved any longer. And Haiti, it was like a crazy rate of like one white person for every 30 enslaved people, which is just not going to work out because people want their freedom. So the largest, most successful slave revolt ever happened in Haiti. And it began in 1791 when slaves burned down the French plantations. And they were inspired by what was happening in France. And in France, the politicians were talking about liberty, equality, fraternity, except for the enslaved people. So these people said, nah, we want the same rights as the other people of France. And they were successful in using violence to overcome their oppressors. And this is a very, very much a celebrated fact today on the island. And we've got a couple of guys who are really important to this revolution. One's name is Toussaint Louverture, who's one of the most fascinating figures in Western history. And he actually had been enslaved for most of his life, but had been able to rise through the ranks and become the leader of the revolution. Okay. Unfortunately, when he took over, he didn't always do great things. And occasionally he kind of stabs people in the back and stuff like that. But he is this national hero that led this revolution. And after the slave revolt in Haiti, France would attempt to retake Haiti. They would send an army. That army would be able to capture Louverture, but would lose. And France would have to give Haiti its independence. There is Mr. Louverture, okay, riding his horse in a dress very much modeled after the French. And after him, a fellow guy named Jean-Jacques Dessalines came into power and eventually rounded up all the French enslavers that were left over and killed them. Okay. And normally we are against mass scales of violence, but I can understand why this decision was made. And in 1803, Haiti became independent. Now, this had a big impact on American history as well. Haiti was the crown of the French colonies. So when France lost Haiti, they kind of said, do we really need any of our other colonies in the New World? And they eventually sold the rest of their colonies, which at the time was called Louisiana, to Thomas Jefferson and the American government. So the loss of Haiti led to the US getting to absorb all of this territory. Okay. And there's Mr. Dessalines and some images of the execution of the slave masters. Now, here's where things get really, really messed up. When France agreed to independence, they had a bunch of conditions on that independence. And while this should be like the greatest moment in human history, a country founded on a slave rebellion, the after effects were not always positive. You had a lot of mixed people of color in Haiti who thought they were better than the fully West African people, and they set up a social structure to keep them in place. But more evilly, France says you can have independence if you pay us back for all of the people we lost. So they had to pay France for the cost of the freed people in their country. And Haiti would not finish paying off this debt until after World War II. And when they're paying off this debt, they can't invest in the infrastructure to build their country up. So unfortunately, Haiti is still one of the poorer countries in the world today, and you can trace a lot of that to these harsh roots of independence, but still something to be proud of from a Haitian. They were able to fight off this colonial power and establish independence. Now, let's turn to our amigos over in Mexico. And in Mexico, you can see they have a much higher GDP per capita, around $9,000. And because things are relatively cheaper in Mexico, this works out to about 17,000 US dollars as far as spending power. The poverty rate is lower, and the life expectancy is much higher, and the infant mortality rate is much, much lower. Let's see if there's anything in Mexico's history that can tell us more about how they came to be in this situation as a middle income country. And I think we mentioned this a little bit last week, but in Latin America, in most of the countries, there was a very strict racist, social structure put into place in which the people born in Spain were at the top, Spanish people born in the New World next, and then different mixed people before putting the Africans and the native peoples at the very bottom. And we see a lot of this social structure still kind of play out today in some of these countries. In Mexico, independence started in 1810 as they tried to get away from Spain. And the initial people who actually led this were the Creoles and the Mestizos. And these are the people who are either white but born in the New World, or mixed of the Spanish blood as well as some Native American blood as well. And they wanted to be seen as the same level as the people in Spain. Think about the rich people in America, the George Washington types. They're kind of like that there. And there is actually a really interesting part to this, and that's one of the first leaders was a priest. And in Latin America, the priests are definitely more involved in social issues, kind of tracing back to this. They're the ones who often speak on behalf of the poor. So Father Miguel Hidalgo is one of the most famous heroes in Mexican history. And even though Mexico would achieve independence by 1821, the lives of the people of most of the poor did not get better for quite a long time. And some would argue that today the lives of the poor are still not looked upon as equally as they should be. The United States is going to play a role of constantly getting involved in Mexican history, as is France. They'll try to conquer Mexico. That's what the Cinco de Mayo battle is all about. Okay. But there is Father Hidalgo. And El Grito was apparently this famous speech he gave, the cry for freedom, that caused them to rush out against the Spanish and try to fight for their independence. And you can see him leading there of some Native American people as well as some other mixed people next to him. And there's many statues today over Mexico City dedicated to these early revolutionary fighters. And that is actually the skull, allegedly, of Father Hidalgo, which you still go see today. I was supposed to go to Mexico City this past summer. Obviously, COVID happened, so it didn't work out. But this is one of the trips I'm most excited to take because I do want to learn a lot more about the history of Mexico. Now, in the United States, a form of democracy, although not real democracy, was established after the revolution. Unfortunately, in a lot of these Latin American countries, democracy is going to take a lot longer to take hold. And so you have people, oftentimes rich generals, who position themselves as the leader of the countries afterwards and often make themselves as emperor or even king in some cases in Latin America. And we have in Mexico, Agustin de Iturbide, and he was from the Spanish army, rebelled against them, helped win Mexican independence, and then made himself emperor. He was chased out by a much more famous guy named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who would be on and off the leader of Mexico for 3 decades. Now, not long after Mexico got its independence, they ended up in some conflict with the United States. And if you see this map here, all of this tan color over here used to be Mexico. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Colorado, Utah, all of these used to be part of Mexico. But of course, there was a series of wars, and America was definitely the aggressor and took a lot of this land away from Mexico. Okay. And there is Mr. Santa Anna, who fought in the Mexican-American War. So Mexico, you guys can do some more research on it for our project because there's so many different topics inside of Mexican history. They've had their independence for a long time, but they've also had interventions from outside powers. Let's turn now to some of the countries of South America, and we want to meet this really important guy. And his name is Simón Bolívar. And Mr. Bolívar has a country named after him, Bolivia. And technically, Venezuela is the Bolivarian Republic de Venezuela. So it's also named after him as well. And he is going to be the George Washington of South America, okay, with both some of the positives of that as well as maybe some of the negatives as well. He was born to a wealthy family in Latin America, so he's the highest social class there, but he is not from mainland Spain. He was not born there. He is going to join up with the native people and the other different mixed people to fight the revolutions against Spain. He thinks that these countries themselves can be powerful without the help of the Spanish. And he was known as being extremely charismatic. He was an excellent horseman, and he would actually fight in battle, and people were very impressed the leader was out there fighting. He was also a very superior general and strategist and was able to pretty much free almost all of Latin America from European control. Okay. Now, I'm not going to get into every single thing that has to do with why these independence movements are happening. Obviously, there's a general push for more equality from the upper classes. Also, Napoleon is just beating everybody up in Europe, which makes Spain and Portugal much weaker. Okay. And there's a lot of class conflict going on. So eventually you get a kind of nationalism that rises in many of these Latin American countries that want their own self-determination, and they want to kick the Spanish out. Unfortunately, most of the countries that will rise out of the Spanish leaving are not that strong. Latin America doesn't have a history of tons of wars between the countries, but they have a history of wars inside of each country. So there's been lots of civil wars ever since independence in Latin America. So Simón Bolívar is the most important guy. He is from Venezuela, and he's able to liberate the countries of Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. Unfortunately, Yay, you're liberated. Now I'm in charge. He tried to make himself a dictator after independence. And many of the people that fought alongside of him thought, why are we trading a king for a dictator? And just like in Mexico, unfortunately, independence does not improve the lives of most poor people in South America. And slavery will last after independence in most of these countries as well. I want to give a big shout out to Mexico. They outlawed slavery right away, and they were a much freer place in the United States for a long time. But I want to give a very negative shout out to Brazil, who kept slavery until 1888. And if we look at this map of Latin America in the year 1800, you can see the Viceroyalty of New Spain. All of this green area is Spanish. Then you got the Portuguese, a little bit of the Dutch and the French. And then after 1830, you see a couple of Spanish colonies left, although not very many, as well as a few Dutch and French. But these are now independent countries. And Bolivar fights from Venezuela through Colombia down into Ecuador and then Peru. And one of his co-fighters, a guy named San Martin, is able to help him win in the South as well. Unfortunately, as well respected as Bolivar kind of still is today, he did try to establish a totalitarian dictatorship in which he had complete control. And he was kind of kicked out of the countries, okay? So he was exiled from where he was trying to set up power and eventually caught tuberculosis and passed away, but still this really important guy to Latin American history. All right, guys, tomorrow I'm going to explain our next little project and give you guys an opportunity to think about what about Latin America today would you most like to research? All right, thank you guys very much. I will talk to you all mañana.